Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nonprofit Enthusiast Live. I'm your host, Lasheena Williams, and so excited to continue this month's conversation on fundraising for your nonprofit organization and how it helps build your nonprofit organization. So I'm excited to have our guest, Marilyn Donnellan, back on with us again. We know from the past she shares a lot of amazing gems, so I'm excited to dive into this topic. So let's go ahead and welcome her up. Hello, hello.
Hi, Lasheena.
So glad to have you back on.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Yes. So for those who may be tuning in for the first time and getting to seeing you for the first time, do you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and how you entered the nonprofit arena?
Well, that was so long ago. It's the dark ages, really. I've been in this business now, hard to believe, about 40 years. And I started in a very, very small nonprofit where I was the only staff person. So I had to learn everything from the ground up. Best thing that ever happened because I learned exactly what it takes to make a nonprofit be effective. And then I spent the next 25 years working in nonprofits of different sizes in 5 different states. And then I turned to consulting, writing, and training. So for the last 20 years, that's what I've been doing. And I've written a lot of books on nonprofit management, and I'm delighted to be able to share them with you and your audience.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you. And so this month we're talking about fundraising and fundraising strategies for nonprofit organizations. What are some tips that you have for organizations?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. But in my book, Implementing the Core Mission, which is part of the Nonprofit Management Simplified series, I
Hmm.
talk about 8 basic principles of nonprofit fundraising. And I'll just quickly run through those to give you an idea, and then we can expand as you see fit. So, for
Okay.
example, the first one is you cannot do effective fundraising unless you have a strategic plan.
Mm,
So, in other words, if you don't have a plan, it's like throwing a dart at a wall with no dartboard. So, strategic planning is a critical part of that because you need to know first how much money you need. You need to know what your organization is all about so you can
hmm.
promote it and so on. The second one is, and I know I sound like a broken record on this, but your infrastructure must be solid. Now, what I mean by that is most nonprofits focus almost entirely on programs and fundraising, and they ignore the basic policies and procedures that are critical to provide the base for programs and fundraising. So make sure all 6 of what I call the core elements are strong and support your programs and fundraising. And the third one, and I know you're going to love this one, Lashina,
Hmm.
is successful fundraising depends on relationships or
Hmm.
friendships. It's always not about what you know, but who you know.
Hmm.
And I learned the hard way that if you don't know your donors, you either don't ask enough, or you ask too much, or you ask the wrong thing.
Hmm.
So all of those are critical, and that gets back to infrastructure because you have to have a database that tells
Hmm.
you about your donors. And I've been privileged to raise millions of dollars over the years. Made a lot of mistakes along the way, but that is basic. The next one is no more than 20% of your budget should come from any fundraising strategy. And
Mm,
that's because if you're focused, say, for example, you get 40% of your budget from government funding. If that funding dries up, you're in trouble.
hmm.
You need to diversify your funding so that if one of them dries up, you don't have a problem. The next one is related to that in its strategies that cost you more than 25% of the gross income. Usually it's not worth the cost. And I'll
Mm,
give you an example. I was in one organization where they had a tradition of doing a rubber ducky race,
mm-hmm.
where they throw hundreds of rubber duckies in the river. The winning duck won a prize. Well, the problem was the cost to put that on was more than what benefited the organization. And
Mm,
when I went to the board about it, they said, "Oh, we can't cancel it. We've always done this." Well, they were failing to recognize the resources that it was taking to conduct it did not
mm-hmm.
bring in the resources that they needed. The next one, volunteers are always the best donors. So you get somebody to volunteer, and the reality is they're going to be a great donor for you.
Mm-hmm.
The next one, people do not give because they are not asked.
Mm,
You don't ask, you don't get.
mm-hmm.
And I remember going into a real estate mogul's office, and nobody had ever been able to get him to make a contribution to the nonprofit. So I thought, okay, here I go. I'm going to make this happen, right? So I asked him for $10,000, which
Mm-hmm.
was the threshold for a major giving donation. He looked at me and he said, "If you had asked me, I would have given you a lot more."
Mm,
And that was an indication I hadn't done my homework.
mm-hmm.
I didn't understand his economic level and
Mm-hmm.
ask an appropriate gift. Well,
Mm-hmm.
fortunately, he eventually came on the board and did become a major donor to the organization. So, in spite of my ineptitude, the organization still benefited. And the last one is fundraising strategies must adapt to changes in the economy, the
Mm,
community, and the nonprofit environment. If you're still using the same old strategies you did 10, 20 years ago, they're just not going to work in today's environment. So, that in a nutshell are what I call the key strategies for fundraising.
love it, love it. So, I'm gonna go back to each one and let's just dive in a little bit more. So, you talked about strategic planning as one of the first
Right.
strategies and keys. And oftentimes, let's say for organizations starting out, we just got started. We got our filings taken care of. We defined our programs. Can you talk about why it's so important to um, uh, to create that strategic plan? And that's going to lend into the second area, which is capacity building that you talked
Right.
about. So let's talk a little bit about those two: strategic planning and how it helps build the organization's capacity. That helps with all the other strategies you talked about.
That's correct. And what happens usually when you mention strategic planning, people roll their eyes. Oh, strategic planning, it's going to take too long. Well, I developed a simplified process that allows the board and staff to develop a 1 year plan in all six of the core elements
Mm,
in one day. And
love it.
what it does is it just focuses in on the key strategies and where you want to be a year from now. We're living in a time when things change so quickly. So the idea of a 5 year, 10-year plan is virtually non existent.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of thinking 5, 10 years on the basic infrastructure issues, you need to say, okay, what is it going to take me to move the organization forward in a sustainable way within
Mm-hmm.
the next year? And that's what the process is. And that process is outlined in my book, Nonprofit Management Simplified Board and Volunteer Development.
Love it. So that means we can pick up your book and it's going
Yeah,
to simplify the process for strategic planning for
correct.
our organization so that we have that foundation to help with some of those other strategies that you shared.
Right, right.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Okay. So, another thing you talked about was successful relationships in fundraising. And then I'm going to lump that with the volunteers as your best donors when it comes to that relationship building part.
Correct.
Um, a concept that has been kind of constant or a constant conversation I've been having is around being able to expose potential donors, your volunteers to your mission. And then
Right.
through doing so, it'll get to the point where you won't necessarily have to make the acts. They're gonna be asking you, how can I help, based off of the capacity that we have to help expand what's happening here. Can we dive a little bit more into that?
Yeah, in fact, you've really touched on a key issue. Too many organizations have vision and mission statements that are way too long. You
Mm-hmm.
need a one statement vision. Vision is where you want to be. Where do you
Mm-hmm.
want to be ultimately? So, for example, if you're running an organization that deals with child abuse, the vision might be all children safe and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
That cuts right to the chase. I
Right.
worked with one organization whose vision and mission statement were 2 pages long.
Oh my gosh.
Well, that's impossible for volunteers to understand and for donors to
Yep.
grasp. So that's a key factor, is that you need to make those statements really concise. So the vision is why we exist. The mission is how we are going to achieve that vision. Now, a key component of these fundraising strategies that are
Mm-hmm.
so important is what I call gift acceptance policies. And I guess
Mm-hmm.
what? I have a book on that too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about making sure that your organization has decided what kinds of gifts you will and will not accept. For
Mm-hmm.
example, if you're an environmental organization and you are suing a major company for violating the environment, if they offer you $500,000 as a donation,
Mm-hmm.
do you accept it? Wow, you think, what could I do with $500,000?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, you're suing that company.
Right.
So if you don't have policies and procedures in place for identifying what gifts you will accept, you're going to have a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
So gift acceptance policies is a big part of all those fundraising strategies. Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely does. Um, so something you talked about, which I heard from several organizations, you were talking about um, how when you made that ask for $10,000, how the potential donor pretty much said, "Hey, I would have given you more." And I heard that up to recently, where same thing, nonprofits say, "Hey, I would love this," and then the person said the same thing. If you asked me for more, I would have given you more. So, how can nonprofits avoid getting placed in these situations? What are some things they can do to prepare for these type of conversations?
Number one, it's all about knowledge. Now, fortunately, with the internet today, you can Google search just about anybody.
Mm-hmm.
So you can even find out the income levels on a lot of people. And there are ways that you can look for income and do searches related to specific individuals, especially if they're prominent in your community. Then you can get an idea of what their income level is. Here's where we get back to the database. Not
Mm-hmm.
only do you need to know how much income they have, but you need to know what their favorite charities are. What are they giving to now? And what are the level of those gifts? And how
Mhm.
can your organization fit into that individual's passions or what they really care about in the community? You have to be able to sell the potential donor on the importance of what you're doing. Let me give you an example, and I have a million of them. If you put a child in a prevention program, let's
Mhm.
say scouting, any kind of church group where they're working with kids, drug prevention, gang prevention, you get them in that at a young age. The chances of that child ever ending up on welfare or the judicial system is less than 1%.
Mm.
That's a phenomenal
Mhm.
statistic. So if you're working with kids, you can say to that donor, you really care about justice. You care about helping kids. And if you invest in our program, we are going to divert children away from gangs and criminal intent into making a
Mhm.
beneficial contribution to the community. So, know your donor, have a database that records what their favorite charities are. And a lot of times you need to know who they associate with. What service clubs are they members of? Um,
Mhm.
and you can relate to that. So maybe you need to join the same service club
Mm.
in order to build that friendship. So it's about friend raising rather than just fundraising.
Mhm. Love that, love that. So researching your donors
Right.
and that helping you know their giving capacity and also what their interests are.
Correct.
Um, awesome. Um, any other areas that we may not have potentially covered that you would like to share?
Um, when you get back to fundraising, uh,
Mm-hmm.
there are, let's face it, some individuals that are much better at the ask than others are. When I first started in this business, I must admit I was a little bit timid about the ask. I didn't want to offend the potential donor and ask too much or too little. But on the other hand, I felt so passionate about what we were doing. I learned that that could translate into donations.
Mm-hmm.
If I had the solid infrastructure, the organization was in good shape, and I could tell the donor, if you invest in our programs, this is how it will benefit the community. Then I can go into the ask with my head held high and say, we're really making a big difference in the community, and we'd like you to join us in making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about building relationships, but it's also about honesty and making sure that your organization is trustworthy. We had one situation a number of years ago where it was discovered that the executive director of an organization had taken over $400,000 from the
Mm.
organization, had embezzled it.
Mm.
Unfortunately, to protect the organization, the board decided not to file charges against that individual. And guess what? He moved on to another organization and is probably doing the same thing again.
Mm.
So I would never
Wow.
trust that individual because of what he did. Is your organization trustworthy? Are the
Mm-hmm.
people trustworthy? Do they have the same passion that you do? Are they involved in the organization because they want to be regarded as one of the up and comers in the community?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they doing it because they really understand your passion, your vision, and
Mm-hmm.
your mission.
Wow. That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to review what we kind of talked about. We talked about the importance of laying that foundation,
Correct.
creating your strategic plan, along with building the infrastructure of your organization. We
Right.
talked about the importance of successful relationships. Something we touched on was no more than 20% of your budget from fundraising. Should be from one particular area of fundraising. So
Correct.
the importance of diversifying your funding for your organization. Strategies that cost you more than 25% are not worth it. I love that you said that, because sometimes through hard work, we feel like, oh, this feels good, we need to just do this. But sometimes it could put our organization in a very interesting situation, because we're
Yes.
spending more than what we're actually being able to bring in, and and a lot of times it's not really moving our mission forward in
Correct.
the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we talked about volunteers being your best donors, and preparing for the ask, doing the research on your donors, and the fundraising must be able to adapt to the change of the environment. What
Correct.
worked yesterday may not work today. A lot of those strategies don't work, just because we've evolved a lot as a community, as nonprofits. You reach different levels. So the way you asked before, not necessarily being the best strategy now. So thank you
Yeah.
so much. Hmm.
A perfect example of that. You remember
Hmm.
the ice bucket challenge?
Yes.
That was a phenomenal fundraising strategy. But if you do some research on the organizations that tried to implement that themselves, none of them were ever as successful at it as that first
Mm.
organization.
Hmm.
So you need to look for that strategy that's unique, that fits your organization. But that doesn't mean you're going to end up finding that ice bucket challenge.
Hmm.
Most of fundraising, let's be honest, is just one foot in front of the other. You're looking for grants, you're doing fundraising events, you're doing individual asks. That whole variety has a much better chance of building sustainability in the long term
Hmm.
than if you think, well, I've got to have an ice bucket challenge in order to have a successful fundraiser. No, you don't.
Yep. Yep. That's so true. And then imagine trying to do that challenge now. That goes
Oh,
back to
yeah.
the environment, and people be like,
Yes.
"That's so a couple of years ago."
Right. Right. Yes. Exactly.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on again, and sharing these wonderful tips with us on the value of fundraising and friend raising for your organization. We really appreciate you coming back on.
Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. As usual, thank you,
Yay!
Lasheena.
Love it. Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Nonprofit Enthusiast Live. Bye, everyone.
Bye.